Polarium. This is one of those kind of like DS launch Windows games that I that get kind of like locked in my head. Like early on, a system's identity for me gets like really defined by those launch games, and some of those titles just like never leave my brain. Like, still never played Pac-Pix, but in my lifetime, I will play Pac-Pix because it was very early on the DS life cycle, and it like occupies a big part of my brain despite not playing it after all these years. Polarium is definitely one of those games, but it's one of those things that like at the time I was like not super interested in it because it is very much, in a lot of ways, a very straightforward puzzle game. Aesthetically, it's got some kind of weird stuff going on, and by weird I mean very plain. And when you look at the gameplay, there's not a lot of like video game style interpretations over top of it. It's just kind of this whole thing where you flip these tiles to basically make the horizontal row all the same color. So in some ways, it vaguely reminds me of like, you know, Sudoku and stuff like that, where it's like a very straightforward presentation. The challenge here is the puzzles. There's not a lot else going on. There's maybe some cute little graphics kind of hidden in the art, but it's not like P-Cross or something like that, where there's like a theme and things like that. So it's very much focused around like pattern recognition specifically, though, because as you kind of go through the game, you know, the early ones are definitely the easiest ones, but these tiles all start getting mixed up in different ways. And as you kind of go through, you have to kind of stare at this puzzle and try to find a way to drag this pen around the screen. When you put your stylus down on the puzzle, you cannot lift it back up. So you have to use one single stroke on the DS screen to go ahead and flip all these tiles. And as these tiles get kind of like jumbled up into different shapes and things like that, you have to really sit down and think about like, where is your line going to go? Because you can't overlap your line. It's kind of like Snake, where if you don't die if you touch the back of your line, but you can't overlap your line basically. So you have to find all the ways that you can get these tiles to switch and then also not overlap any lines, or also not accidentally flip over tiles that should be one way or the other. So there might be like a tile you want to flip, but another row of tiles is in front of it. So you have to figure out, do I need to get in there to flip that tile, or do I just need to like clear the tiles surrounding it instead, kind of thing? Because you just kind of recognize where that pattern is. And early on, it's pretty straightforward and pretty easy to get through. I'd say probably around like 40-ish. I think there's 100 levels total. Probably around like 40-ish levels. Things really kind of started to bog down a little bit. I would say it's a very inconsistent difficulty level, though, because basically levels come at you in like 10 level chunks. And I'm not sure if there's like a consistent theme between them in terms of the patterns being used. I do think as time goes on, they kind of rely more on these like very like checkerboard patterns that are a lot harder for me to solve at the very least. But it seems like you can get through maybe like 5 or 6 of the patterns within a 10 level category pretty easily. Then you have like kind of 4 that just kind of really stick, and they don't seem to be in a particular order. It just seems like there are 4 that just are hard to deal with, at least for me personally. So yeah, but there's not really any gimmicks here or anything like that. It is just a steady introduction of new patterns, and you kind of having to use your brain to figure out, you know, what is the best way to navigate around these patterns and things like that. I definitely started to struggle really hard towards the end of the game. I'm not great at puzzle games, and I think there is a pretty cool hint system in this game that I think does a good job of trying to inform you of what to do next without really giving it away. Basically, they tell you where the starting point is of each individual block, or each block on the field, so you can like see what block you need to start at, and then over time it'll also show what the final block will be, and you can kind of sit down and figure out, okay, what is the path I need to draw between these 2 blocks. There's not only one solution, though. There's definitely been times where I got the hint for both blocks of where it should start and begin. But at the same time, I had seen another pattern that would work, and so I sat down and kind of worked that pattern out, and it worked just fine. So each of these puzzles seem to have like multiple solutions as well, not just the one they kind of prescribe to you. You know, there's not one solution basically. So, but yeah, I think that's just kind of the thing, though, is that like there's no real very clear and apparent difficulty or change in what's going on here. Like there's definitely, it feels like the panels get a lot more complicated, but there's just not really a lot to diversify the experience. And I think part of this too is like the aesthetic of the game, where like very little changes in the aesthetic of the game. And in some ways, it's a very boring aesthetic. It's very like computery. I don't mean computer. It's very minimalistic. Let's put it that way. And there's only like one song in the entire game and things like that. So it feels like very straightforward, despite the bottom, you know, the foundation of this game being pretty solid in my opinion. But when I think about it, when I pull the aesthetic out of Polarium specifically, I think one thing that's fascinating about this game is that, unlike the Wii, which had like a very defined aesthetic from the start based off like the Wii channels and things like that, the DS kind of had this like weird beginning period where I think Nintendo still wasn't quite sure what the DS should look like. Not only from the DS Fat to the DS Lite aesthetic, but also in the user interface. Because if you look at the user interface of the DS, Polarium actually feels like really similar to that user interface. And as a kid, I thought it was really cool that they had a user interface on the DS. Like I even like on the GameCube, I loved seeing like the game descriptions pop up when you put a disc in. And so like getting a little bit of an expanded version of that on the DS was kind of cool. And then you also get like PictoChat and things like that. And Polarium kind of feels like if it was embedded in the DS menu as like a default game, it actually would make a ton of sense. And like if it in some ways make it like even cooler that it like was like a part of that whole aesthetic. But the DS didn't really like stick with that aesthetic, I don't feel like. At some point, even with like the DSi, they basically adopted the Wii aesthetic into that interface and things like that. So it feels like Polarium kind of feels like this weird relic of like, what if we made a game that like fit the aesthetic of the DS menus, which I don't know how many people really think about the DS menus anymore, but it's just kind of interesting to see it in that light. And I think that's kind of a cool part about it. So that's at least my biggest takeaway, which is I don't think I like this game that much. I think it was like fine. I think it's a fine puzzle game. And when it comes to early games on systems of this era, like the DS, most games within the launch year are going to be fine. So I think that's why Polarium kind of got so much attention back then, was that like it was just a solid puzzle game on the DS. And it uses the stylus as well. So like it kind of like fit within, I think what people were looking for, just a cool game on DS that used the stylus and it was like really solid overall. And I think Polarium like does a really good job with that. Is it something worth playing today? I mean, personally, I kind of feel like I could have done without it, honestly. But, like I said, DS launch game, it kind of occupies this part of my brain. Not launch game, but launch year game. It kind of occupies this part of my brain that, like, is for some reason sacred and like all the games of that era just kind of like stick within there and they like never leave my mind kind of thing. But I forgot to mention there's like a falling block mode in this as well. It's the same every time though, so it's like a memorization thing. I think there's actually a training thing where you can basically train to like memorize all of them. But yeah, it basically takes some of the boards of the game and kind of like throws them down on the bottom screen, and you have to kind of like clear the boards quickly before the next row falls down. And I think you get like 2 or 3 rows that can fall down. So it's pretty all right. I didn't personally love that mode, but I thought it was fine. But maybe if you're like super more into like the mechanics of the game, it would make a lot more sense. But Polarium, it was okay.